Hey, Robin.
Hello, hello. I'm just now making Glenn a host. I'm also going to make you a host, Brian.
Ooh, I've never been a host before.
Let's see. Seeing some familiar faces here. Super excited that everyone is joining us. I don't actually know if I can make more than one host at a time. So
I don't think you can, Robin.
Okay, perfect. Well, it is 11:30 Pacific. Shall we start?
Yes.
Great. And I'm sure I actually just see people are continuing to join, but we can catch up as we go. So super excited to have everybody here. Thank you all for coming to the first responsive webinar. This has been an idea that has been percolating, I think, in the community for a long time. If we haven't met, my name is Robin Zander. I'm the founder and director of Responsive Conference. And at the end of the day, Responsive.org was created to be a community where people could come up with ideas and then implement them. So Glenn, who is going to be conducting the interview today, was an attendee at Responsive Conference in September, and a couple months later emailed me and we sat down and he said, I want to continue to move this community forward. I think there's so many ideas that are worth sharing. How do we go about doing that? And so he and I together hatched this idea, and we're really excited to be kicking off today with this interview with Brian. I've known Brian for a handful of years. He attended a summit that we put on for CEOs and managers of self-organized companies called the Rework CEO Summit in 2017. And he's done a lot of very interesting explorations around holacracy and team design at Google, which I'm sure we'll dive into much more. So the goal is that this is going to become a monthly or even twice monthly series, but feel free to drop messages in the group chat. I'm sure we'll have time for Q&A, and I'll let Glenn take it over from here. Maybe just as a way to introduce yourself, Glenn, other than obviously as an attendee of Responsive Conference, I'd love to have you share with everyone a little bit about your background, which has been diverse and varied, but in this space for a long time, and then by all means, take it over.
Thank you. As Robin mentioned, I attended the Responsive Conference and was actually mesmerized by the people I met and the non-conference or the unconference manner of it. My background is actually clinical psychology. I worked for 21 years in the profession, still carry a license, and I've worked for some of the largest organizations on the planet, including the military and the VA. And through my different experiences in different organizations, it became really clear to me how when managers and leaders listen to people, how much healthier the workplace was. And since a lot of my work was with patients, how much healthier the patients, how much better the service is. Morale was better. And the converse, as I'm sure almost everybody has experienced with certain leaders and managers who don't participate in a collaborative style, everything gets a little wonky. So at a certain point in time, I decided I wanted to work more with organizational behavior than with individual behavior. I went and got an MBA, moved out to the Bay Area, and am working with doing consulting with some organizations and building healthier teams, more employee engagement. And that's sort of one thing led to another, and crossed paths with Robin and a bunch of other folks. And here I am. So one of the things I just want to start with you, Brian. Why don't you introduce yourself and just tell people who you are for those who don't know you and where you live and what your work is.
Sure. I'm Brian Haney. I live in Seattle, and I work for Google. The Google company directory says I'm a program manager for the cloud support team, but I spend a majority of my time doing. I call it my 20% time project, but it's more than that. It's doing team dev consulting, where we there's about 75 or 100 of us who are partner with team leaders and work with them to kind of cultivate to construct a team development agenda for, maybe they have an offsite planned or they're doing a global summit for their team, because we're spread out all over the place often. And then I either design the event, tweak it, and then I usually facilitate that event. And at the end of the day, my goal is to make not just teams more effective. That's what Google wants, but I want to make working on these teams more fulfilling. And so that's what really what motivates me. Yeah, that's where I, oh, and then I've got I should also do my my disclaimer. I need to make it clear that I do not speak for Google. I am sharing only my personal experience, and I don't put words in Google's mouth because that's unsanitary. So just take. I can share my experience, my perspective, but I don't take anything I say as something that Google endorses or condones.
Okay, before we jump in a little bit further, for those of you who are not familiar with the Zoom platform, which is how we're hosting this, everybody is muted. If you want to ask a question, if you type into the chat, which is one of the icons at the bottom of your screen, you can type in your question and we can then unmute you so that you can ask your question, or if you just want to ask a question without being seen, because if you speak, everybody will see you. If you'd rather stay anonymous and just ask the question, just type the question into the chat. And Brian, do you have a preference for whether people ask as we go, or would you rather wait till the end for questions? What's your preference?
If a question comes up that's relevant to what we're talking about in the moment, I'd rather answer it in the moment rather than trying to save context and switch back to that.
Okay, great. So tell us, just so we can get to know you a little bit better before we dive into what you actually do every day in your work life. Give us a little background. I know you grew up in Northern California, a stone's throw from where Robin grew up. Did you know each other before?
No, I'm a little bit older than Robin, I suspect. I don't know how old he is, but so we went to rival high schools. He attended in Sebastopol. I attended the high school in Forestville, just down the road a ways. What else do you want to know?
And then you went to UC Berkeley.
Yeah, well, there was a little dalliance with the Coast Guard there. I thought I wanted to be a Coast Guard officer, so I went to the Coast Guard Academy for a year, and then I got homesick and decided I wanted to be a civilian again, which they let you do for the first 3 years, which is kind of great. So I left there and went to UC Berkeley. I majored in an obscure field of engineering called naval architecture, so I learned how to design ships. Practiced that for about 6 years for the U.S. Navy after I got out of after I graduated. Then I discovered the internet, and they were threatening to close the shipyard where I was working. So I decided to do a career change, and I've been playing on the internet ever since. That was, I guess, 1993 when I did that career change.
And how did you end up at Google?
Well, I'm not sure why they hired me still. They don't actually share that information with you when they hire you. But I spent 10 years self-employed as an internet consultant. Spent 2 years working for the University of Washington, doing their network support for a department. And then I submitted I saw an ad on Craigslist that said, system administration in Seattle, submit your resume here. I clicked there, it took me to a Google site, and I said, oh, gosh, I hear it's so hard to get hired by Google. I'll send them my resume and see what happens. I don't expect anything of it. That was in April. In June, they emailed back and said, "Are you still interested?" And I was very interested because I just completed my second consecutive 80-hour work week, getting ready to host a conference at the University of Washington. So I joined Google in November 2006. And have been on not a roller coaster ride, on a sleigh ride ever since.
So tell us a little bit about, what year did you start at Google?
2006.
And so you have gone through major reinventions and metamorphoses.
This is not the same Google that hired me. I assure you that.
So how would you describe the culture there as it exists today? It's specifically in terms of how it ties into responsive organizations, the flexibility, the adaptability, incorporating different ideas from people.
From a cultural perspective, Google is maturing. I mean, we're last I heard, we were almost 100,000 full-time employees, and there's a constant tension between growing at how do we scale up at the same time don't calcify with bureaucracy, and so that's probably the leading overarching tension that I see, and it's a little bit more well from a responsive perspective. Google tries to let leaders lead and not get in their way. At least that's how I observe it. I don't know what the official policy is, but my sense is that leaders often have they have a long leash to run their organizations the way they see fit, and that's what led my director back in 2016 to decide we were going to. Well, we actually decided in 2015 that we were going to use Holacracy. And we implemented that in 2016, experimented with it for a while. Then there was reorganization, and our Holacracy experiment became what would you call it? A word choice failure. The second, it became a victim, for lack of a better word, of that reorganization. And but I learned a lot from it and decided that I feel like my eyes were open from that experiment, and I see that is the future of how we organize going forward, is really moving away from the 20th century model of hierarchy and toward a I don't want to call it egalitarian, but that might be the best description for it. But something that's where power is far more shared.
In what happened that the experiment became a victim of?
What happened was, so I work on the cloud platform support team. Well, I did it. My focus was on cloud platform alone at the time, and Google Cloud is growing so fast that it became apparent that we needed to form another team and to focus on a different problem set in the market. And our director decided to. Well, he had some ideas on how to do that, and so his senior director said, "Okay, you go start that team." And so the replacements that came in to fill his shoes, we didn't have good, well-articulated objectives and metrics, and so they didn't understand what we were trying to accomplish or the methodology of Holacracy. So, but without that sense of commitment to it from the outset, we had just gotten to the point where we were wrestling with some of the more difficult aspects of Holacracy, and so there was a general sense for a general sense of why are we doing this before the new directors came in, and so they decided we don't have a lot of time to play around with this, so we're going to go back to the hierarchical model and just move forward, and so we did.
Okay, I have a couple questions from participants
Sure.
regarding that. One is, how many people were engaged in the team that was experimenting with Holacracy, and how long did the experiment last?
That was about 75 people, and the experiment lasted about 3 months.
Okay, and what were the difficulties that having to do with Holacracy itself? What were some inherent stumbling blocks?
Oh, I'd say that the biggest was just getting used to the process of things like when you participate in a meeting, you need to identify what role that you're speaking from, because you might fulfill multiple roles on that team or in that circle, as Holacracy calls it. So this is one aspect. Another is in governance meetings, when there's using what they call the integrative decision-making process. There's a very fixed structure of that one where the floor is open for everybody to comment when they're called upon. But after that, if you have an opinion on the decision, unless it affects a role that you fulfill, you don't have a voice. And it takes. We're used to reaching consensus kind of in an open format. It's very unstructured. It's often ineffective or inefficient, but it's what we're used to. And so getting the team used to this new structure, it kind of chafed at some of our habits.
Was 90 days long enough?
No, not at all. We at the outset. Let's see. Oh gosh. I can't remember his name now. Brian Robertson. His name was Brian. I should remember that. Anyway, he told us at the outset that there's a curve to learning Holacracy, that you start at an initial level of effectiveness, or you feel like you know what you're doing, and the team is working well. It declines down to a trough, and that takes about 3 months, and that's where we were. Where you're saying this isn't working. This is hard. Why are we doing this? And then it takes about 3 months to get back up to that same level of proficiency or a sense of effectiveness. But then you keep on climbing. At least that's what we were promised. But we got to the bottom, and then we were asked to not do it anymore.
So a follow-up question from somebody has to do with, why did the leadership abandon it? Now you made some references. It was a change in leadership, and they wanted to just, they chose expediency over process at that point?
Yes. So again, we're growing so fast, and the business needs of the organization don't have a lot of slack for running experiments. Unless there's a very near term and high promise of improvement from those experiments. But we had a change of leadership. When the new directors came in, I asked them immediately to ratify the Constitution again. They did. 3 weeks later, they said this isn't working for us, so we're going to go back to the hierarchical model.
Okay. I think there are a lot of questions about Holacracy, and we will have a couple of webinars that specifically address Holacracy in more detail. If I'm understanding your response, you're a believer in this system.
Absolutely. I recognize that there's a certain degree of dogma around Holacracy. But the way coming out of our Holacracy experiment, after I got over I was very emotionally invested in its success on my team, and so it took me a couple of weeks to kind of feel normal again. But I decided that first we had to do I had to do a post-mortem analysis, as we call them at Google, where we analyze the failure and try and extract what can we learn from this. So I did that, and I learned a few things about what was really chafing or causing some consternation on my team. I said, "Oh, okay, that's interesting." And then the more I thought about it, the more by that time I had gone through Holacracy coaching training. I never went through certification because my team wasn't running Holacracy anymore, but I had the train to look at it and say, "Oh, now I understand why we do that, but we don't have to do it that way." So I actually found I could tease apart the components of Holacracy, which they told us at the beginning that it was kind of impossible. But I get it that if they're going to do it as quickly and as painlessly as possible, they don't want you playing with the structure. But I see ways to deconstruct the Holacracy model and then reconstruct it in a different sequence that it's a shallower ramp. So I liken it into it's, if Holacracy is a mountain that you're climbing, you don't want to go up the face of the cliff. There's a road around back that's a whole lot easier to climb. It takes you longer, but it's a much more pleasant climb. And that's the path I see, that you still get to the top and you don't implement Holacracy all at once as a monolithic model. And I see that as having a whole lot more potential than the way we tried to do it the first time. But again, it takes a while, and it would require keeping an eye on the goal, but at the same time you can stop along the way and camp there for a while. There's nothing that says you have to get from here to there within 6 months or within a year. You can get to a certain point and say, well, this part of Holacracy is working for now. Let's just hang here. It's not Holacracy is a trademark. It is not it does not adhere to the definition of Holacracy as a model, but it works. So I see that there's a path to do that. I don't have any data to show that path actually works. So I'm very much looking for teams inside or outside of Google that want to experiment, and I'd be happy to share some ideas on how to do this differently. And as an experiment and see what you learn from it, and then maybe pivot and do it a little differently.
So this is very helpful information, and I'm going to segue into your new work, but I want to ask you some background questions. As a clinical psychologist for 21 years working with human beings, when I read a lot of these theories, and you've identified something I've seen a lot, is that the models sound good, but the problem often is having people adapt to the models. People have emotions, people behave badly, people resist changes, things of that nature. So for all of the people listening to this who would like to initiate some changes in their organization, that would like to be more holacratic, if that's a term, from your experience, from the failures, since mostly what we read about are the successes, what might you suggest? What guidance would you offer to leaders and managers who want to incorporate some of these whole-scale changes into their organizations?
Don't design it, evolve it. Start small, take baby steps, and run little experiments. If you're familiar with the Lean Startup book by Eric Ries, he advocates in a startup context that you run micro experiments to validate your assumptions. So don't assume that this model or that model is actually going to work. Take baby steps, experiment, learn about it, and decide if do you want to continue down that path or you want to pivot and go in a different direction. And so I recommend adopting be light on your feet and don't be committed to a particular outcome or a particular way to get there.
You made reference to, in the postmortem, and some of your work now wanting to work with teams. Tell us a little bit about what you've done, what's worked, and what your vision is, and you're moving forward.
Well, inside Google, about a year and a half ago, I discovered what we call our Team Dev G2G group. Google has a G2G program where Googlers are invited to contribute 20% of their paid work time to cultivate or develop other Googlers, either by teaching classes or by doing one-on-one coaching. And so I found this Team Dev G2G team that does this team dev consulting, and I went through the onboarding process for that. I actually started taking engagements about a year ago, and I'm using that as a way to kind of a platform to stand on to engage with team leaders who want to change the way their teams are running, and I'm aside from learning a whole lot more about different ways to lean into the same values that I have about building fulfilling work and empowering teams. I also see that as a way to engage with team leaders and hopefully find team leaders that are amenable to experimenting with self-management. And as I have not found anybody who knows how to spell holacracy or understands it. Maybe they might have heard of it, but it sounds big and hard, and they don't want to go there. But I can work with them to design a team activity where they can experiment with a particular way of relating to each other a little bit better, either improve communication or collaboration or build more psychological safety. Those kinds of things they're approaching the same goal of empowering teams, but in smaller steps. And so I feel like I'm kind of plowing the ground right now before I start planting the seeds of holacracy. Outside of Google, and so this is my goal. My personal mission at Google is to cultivate team self-management, to empower teams. That's what really drives me. And when I get the sense that I'm not being effective in that at Google, I'll leave. Because I've got to do this. This is something I feel committed to do. And so before I'm nowhere near that decision point. But at the same time, if I'm going to leave, I want to have a side business to jump right into, so I could provide this for other companies outside of Google. And so I'm just starting a side business. I call it my lifeboat. So when I jump ship, I have something to land in. Through that, I want to offer coaching and consulting to help other teams become more effective and become more engaging and become more fulfilling for the people who work in them.
So let's walk through some of the steps. Again, for all the people who are listening, if we want to build healthier teams, more engaged and more fulfilling teams, what's the process? Where do you start? What do you know that you would offer to people? What do you know that works?
What I know works is ultimately the leader has to trust a team and hold power loosely and build a stronger faith that the team can make good decisions without being told what to do, without being directed. And if that is what it takes for a leader to empower their team, then we need to work with. We start by working with a team to first be able to trust each other and be collaborative and work together. With psychological safety, with a sense of purpose. Those two, I think, are the single biggest factors. Is first, every effective team at Google has a foundation of psychological safety. They can trust each other. They can say, "Hope that was my mistake," or "This is confusing me. I need some help." Where people can't say that, nothing else is going to work. So first, build psychological safety, then start cultivating a sense of purpose.
Let me interrupt you for a second.
Sure.
If it doesn't exist, you're working with a team that this is new, it's a newly developed team, or it's a team that's been around for a while, and people don't trust each other. what are some suggestions for helping to lay the groundwork to build that psychological safety? There's
Step one
reams
is
of stuff out there. What works with your experience?
in my experience, the most effective thing is for the leader to demonstrate vulnerability, to show that, hey, I've made mistakes, and to tell stories about their mistakes, and tell stories about the concerns, about their doubts, about their self-doubts. That modeling that vulnerability invites others to be vulnerable too, and it cultivates a framework to have vulnerable conversations. Beyond that, when the team can get, the more the team gets to know each other, if you and I, Glenn, are on the same team, and I don't know you, you're the other. If I don't know you, I don't trust you because you're the unknown. So one of the first things we need to do is I need to get to know you better, and you need to get to know me. So I know where you're coming from. I can assume that you have best intent. So even if you say something that strikes me as being a little odd, I don't take it immediately as an offense or a threat, because I can have a better sense for how you think or what your values are, and so in team development exercises, if there's a weakness in psychological safety, or if a team is in a forming stage where they're trying to kind of jockey for position and see how this is going to work with a new leader or new team members. First thing to do is just get to know each other and do exercises together. It might be something simple like building a castle out of balloons, and just see how the team works together, and to learn how people approach problems, and do they jump in, are they tactical, or they step back, are they more strategic, and how do they plan it, how do they execute it. That sense of getting to know each other, so you know how you approach problems and what your values are. That's probably the first step down that path.
Okay. So before we go down the line, and I interrupted you when you were starting to talk about values and purpose, I want to ask a tangential question. I am guessing that almost everybody who's listening to this and will eventually listen to this has worked with bosses who talk about how important teams are, how important employees are, and then just don't follow through. They cut people off in conversations. They don't allow that psychological safety. You've had to have that. You have had to have had that experience in Google, yes?
Yes, and that's why when I'm engaged as outside of the context of a team dev consultant, yes, I've had team leaders for teams that I've been on that they really like being in the driver's seat, or sitting in the as front of the wagon, holding the reins and whipping the horses into gear, and it's not a sustainable model because it tends to make it doesn't invite the best out of the team. Let's put it that way.
So in your experience, you have highlighted, and I've heard this from coach after coach after coach after coach, that everything has to start with the leadership. Is there a way to lead not being at the top, to bring about some culture changes as part of a team member, even if you haven't fully gotten buy-in from the top?
Yes, and that is an attribute that we cultivate at Google explicitly. Influence without authority is what we call it. Nobody reports to me. I am not a manager. I don't lead a team, but I have my own sense of leadership. One by practicing what is sometimes called the leader within, and becoming more self-aware and being able to self-manage me as a person. But then when I engage with others at Google, if I have a stance that is more partnering, coming alongside and saying, hey, we can solve this problem together, that while that tone, that way of being tends to cultivate a a team effort without a leader. And so the more that's very very much a kind of dynamic that is sought after or reinforced at Google, and so that's probably the biggest way to lead without being a leader, well, without having leader in your job title.
Okay, so buy-in from the top. If it's an organization that allows more of a democratic process, then anybody can have some influence. Building psychological safety through leaders, expressing vulnerability, team building. What's next in your approach? You started to talk about values and some other factors.
Well, as part of the get to know you, to build psychological safety, the better I know you. One is understanding how you solve problems. So that's understanding how your frontal lobe works, and just how you approach problems from a cognitive standpoint. But the next level is, okay, what's driving you? How do you feel? And what informs those feelings? What's important to you? And that gets down to what are your core values? If your core values are very self-centered and you want to just boost your career as fast as you can, then you're not gonna be available to help me. So I'm not going to be vulnerable to you. At the same time, if you and I have a shared purpose where we're trying to accomplish something as collaborators, as a team, well, then that shared purpose, that becomes a value, because you and I say we want to see this happen. We have a vision for what we want to materialize, and we can work together towards it. So by recognizing that together we can accomplish more than we can individually, then we're able to march down a path where we're working together for shared objectives.
So when you talk about the values and you talk about getting to know what motivates other people, what drives them, are you talking about this as, again, I want to frame this in the context of people that are working in teams, people that are leading organizations, people that want to create higher performance. Is that a one-on-one conversation? Is that a group conversation? Is that a facilitated conversation?
The answer is yes. The norm at Google is usually it's weekly, but some teams are kind of busy and large, so that might be biweekly. But every manager has a one-on-one conversation with their direct reports for at least half an hour. That's the norm. That's the expectation.
Every week.
Every week.
Okay.
Now, with my manager, I do it every other week because I'm spending most of my time doing stuff that he doesn't care about so much. Let me reframe that. He cares about it, but he doesn't participate in it as closely as the team dev work that I do. Anyway, so he and I meet regularly, and we have quarterly career conversations. So where he understands my aspirations, where I want to be a year from now, 5 years from now, and I trust him because I think he's an enlightened manager. If you're here, Sean, hi. He has my best interest at heart, even though he is also beholden to Google. So he has to resolve that tension between Google's objectives and my objectives. But he can recognize that those are not always at odds with each other. In fact, they very rarely are at odds with one another. And so there's a very strong culture of to quote the U.S. Army commercial of yesteryear, be all that you can be.
Learning about and are reviewed regularly, or in a lot of organizations, you'll go in and you'll see the values on the wall, and that's the beginning and the end of it. How does Google keep those alive?
That is, That is a question that is very, very dynamic right now. So a couple of years ago, it became apparent that we needed to have a shared sense of or sense of shared values, and so the Google leadership team came out with a short list of values that are they're not. I don't want to say that they're well. They're very simple values. They're values we can all agree on, and we it's very easy to be able to point to those and say this is where we're going. But when I'm working with teams, we want to kind of unpack that a little more and maybe get a little deeper than what those shared corporate values state. So there is a canonical Google values, but every team has it can go deeper than that too.
Okay. So here's some conflicts that I've encountered that you've had to encounter as well. Is what do you do with people who are really talented, but their values don't align with your team's values or the organization's values?
The genius jerk. Yeah.
Never heard that expression. Thank you for that.
We get those every now and then, and when we start with never having led a team myself, I can't say I've ever had to deal with that problem personally. My understanding is that they're coached by their manager. They might be, and they might be coached by a third party. I don't know exactly what resources are available for that at Google, but and if the jerkness can't seem to be changed, then they are encouraged to seek work elsewhere, and they're given a certain amount of runway to say, this isn't working for us, and so we want to invite you to work in a context that is more suited to your other needs, and then they're ultimately they get the message, and they usually will leave of their own accord.
Okay. Do you have any idea what the turnover rate is at Google?
No, I don't. Lately, I've been more surprised at it just because I've been here for over 12 years. This is the best. I've worked for the federal government, a state government. I've been self-employed. I've never worked for another large company, but I can't imagine it getting better than this. And according to the surveys, this is one of the best places to work in the world. So I can't imagine anyone leaving. But from what I hear, people leave companies because they don't leave companies. They leave bad managers. And so I don't know how to influence that dynamic, but someday I hope to be able to have an influence on managers to help them be less of the exit path for Googlers.
And Google has made headlines in the last couple of years over issues of diversity. What's your experience? Does it seem like it's a diverse, robust environment, or is it something that's still in a work in process?
Well, that's a hot button topic I was worried about before doing this webinar. I will share my experience. I have not seen some. I can't say I've been aware of the kinds of problems that have been cited in the press. I know they happen, but I don't know all the particulars. And I know I also know there's stuff I don't know. For example, last fall there was an executive who was dismissed for sexual misconduct or sexual harassment, and the press said that he got a severance package, but Google has more details, but they're not allowed to share the details because it's a private matter, and so they have a legal obligation to keep those details private. I have a suspicion that it wasn't a severance package he received, but he sold his stock that he had received months or years prior. So the nature of the payout, I'm sure if Google execs say no, he did not get a severance package, he didn't get a severance package, but there might have been some other package that he got.
Okay. Am I correct in assuming you are not a millennial? You don't identify yourself as a millennial?
I do not. I'm a late baby boomer.
Okay. And Google certainly has been influenced by the millennial mindset. And now we have Generation Zers. What's the culture like working with people from very different backgrounds and very different upbringings? How does that play out?
At first, are different. There was a stark difference in motivation in core values that I wasn't quite sure how to resolve. And so we have here at the Seattle office, we have monthly listening lunches where site leadership, which is usually an engineering director or VP, there's several of them, but they will come, and people who want to attend, they're welcome to show up. We sit in a big circle in a big room, and anything we want to bring up that we want leadership to hear, or particularly about local culture and diversity inclusion is often high on that list. They're there to listen. So that's the whole purpose of the lunch. At one of those lunches that I was attending, there was a relatively new hire, recently out of college, who said he expressed his the way he phrased it was, I don't know why you all are here, but I'm here for the money. And I'm thinking, no, that's not why I'm here, because I'm sure that my resume is rich enough. I can shop it around. I don't need that. I'm here to change the world, and Google is a high profile company in that. A lot of companies look up to say, how should I run my company? How does Google do it? We'll model ourselves after Google. I hear about that all the time, and so I see what the impact I have at Google. I'm hoping that'll have a ripple effect on the industry, but when I heard that from that new Googler across the room, my first thought was, oh, you poor boy. You don't get it, do you? And so there's a sense of, okay, if he's in it for the money, that he's kind of lower on Maslow's hierarchy than I am. I'm trying to get, I'm somewhere near self-actualization, I think. But he's still working on, okay, I'm trying to pay off my car loan. I'm trying to pay off my student loans. And so he's down, around trying to make ends meet, and then trying to find happiness in his income, and maybe climb the career ladder so he gets more power and influence that way. And so that's the way that he might be stepping up Maslow's hierarchy. So that's what I see as just a stark example of we're different. The different things drive us.
And do you think there is in your experience, do you find a generational variance in values, or do you think that's more individual?
I would expect that if you're to do a measure a sample size of the millennial population and assess their values on some kind of an axis, that you'll find that those are generally different from my age group, and there is a somewhat, probably not linear, but a regularly increasing structure there from one state to the next. But I also know that there are variations amongst the millennial population. So you cannot make assumptions that oh, you're a new hire, that means you must only be driven by your salary. So you only respond to extrinsic motivation. I'm very much driven by intrinsic motivation. For example, I was taking a coaching class. No, I was assisting in a coaching class about 4 months ago, and there was a young woman there who was, I think she was 21 or 22, and her coaching skills were amazing. I look at her and I thought, there is a 1,000-year-old soul in that 22-year-old body. She remarkably mature. And so I don't know how that came about, but it's out, I'd say she's an outlier.
So you've been at Google 12 years.
Yeah.
Yes. What surprised you the most in your 12 years?
Life-size T-Rex sculptures at Google headquarters. That was the first thing that made my jaw drop. Then it was the SpaceX model inside.
In terms of what has helped you to become better at what you do, what surprised you the most? What ideas did you have about how organizations run that you look back and go, it totally shocked me. I have no idea that that's how the world actually works.
I don't want to call it shock because I became more aware of it over time. Mm-hmm. So I can't say it was a big aha moment, but the sense that Google really values developing people, and if you're on a growth curve, you're on the right curve. And so they do that at the executive level, at the middle management level, at the personal level, for individual contributors. And that is a core value that Google has that they have not stated explicitly, but it's apparent in just about everything I see.
So is it fair to say that one tool or one take-home that every organization can benefit from is how important that it pays off to value people and to develop them? Yes.
And talking about intrinsic motivators, that's one of my core intrinsic motivators is Dan Pink writes about agency, mastery, and purpose. Well, mastery is learning a skill and getting good at it and then being able to practice it. And so that has always motivated me ever since college, and Google does that in spades.
Okay. And what would you advise people who are listening to this to not do, based on your experience and your observations? What are some of the, gee, it made sense, it looked good on paper, the theory sounded good, and in reality it just didn't work? And don't save yourself some hassle and don't try this.
Don't shoot for the moon. It's okay to have big aspirations, but don't assume that you can plot a course between here and there and execute and stay that course for the entire journey, because the moon's going to move, or something else is going to break along the way, or there's something else you didn't expect. So be light on your feet and be ready to pivot when early. The earlier the better.
Okay. And you have made reference several times when we talked about holacracy about not giving it enough time, starting more slowly, making it a more level ramp rather than a steep climb. Let's talk a minute about disruption within Google. I mean, part of what Google has done in the universe has been this massive disruptor of how we manage information. And in 12 years, you've commented also that it's not the same Google you went to work for. Is disruption inherent every day in Google, or does it come in waves? And how do people respond to the disruption?
You used a magic word. You called it waves. We're used to having we as a people, using our 20th century model of what an organization is. We have an organizational chart. It's fairly static. It doesn't change much. You know who to go to, what everybody's responsibilities are. That's obsolete. We're moving into a place where the organizational chart changes every single day. And so we're moving from a lithic or a stonework model of the organization to a fluidic model of the organization, where it comes in waves, but it's still fluid. And so we have to move from a structural engineering to fluid dynamics. And we have to move from a design model. I see it as we're in the middle of a paradigm shift from engineering the organization to cultivating the organization. We're moving away from design to gardening.
Well put. We're going to wrap this up in a few more minutes. Before we ask a few final questions, if anybody from who's participating has some questions you want to type in, we will present them. Brian, how do people get a hold of you if they want to reach out to you and ask you questions or anything of that nature?
BKH@briankhaney.com.
Okay, and if people just want to have a conversation or want to hire you, are you receptive to that?
I'm receptive to both.
Okay, and one more time, BKH at?
BrianKHaney.com.
And Haney is Haney and Brian is Brian.
Yes.
Okay. And for those of you who have not signed up for responsive.org, I want to invite you to sign up for the newsletter and get information about the annual conference at responsive.org. If you have any comments about the webinar, ideas, suggestions, you want to be interviewed, you want to share some of your skills and talents, you can go to the responsive.org website and hit contact and send a message. If you want to get a hold of me, I'm at Glenn, Glenn, at Glenn, Glenn, Marks, Marks.com. Yes. Robin, can you help out and type in Brian? There it is. Okay, excellent. Having a redesigned org chart that makes one ask, how do you change the remuneration, the payment, the compensation system when you change an organizational chart? Are you involved with that in any capacity, or is that outside of your domain?
That's way outside of my domain.
And does Google do that?
Describe the problem again.
When Google tried Holacracy, did they change pay scales at all, or was it everybody?
No, this is pay scales are all managed in our people ops group. So our Holacracy experiment was at our director level and below. He was investing his authority in the Holacracy Constitution. So one of our challenges was we had to present a Google compatible interface to the rest of Google. So they what they saw as managers, we call them leaders, and sometimes we had leaders who were not managers.
So it is a challenge, but outside of your turf to have any influence on that. Any more tips for working with and coaching leaders to increase buy-in to some of these more holacratic approaches, to helping build more team effectiveness?
Start with the business objectives. I mean, one of the things that they say at Holacracy, Holacracy 1 is it's all about organizing around the work, not around the people. And so there's a very strong sense of we're doing this to get work done and be more agile and nimble around that work. Spend more, stay focused on the work, because that's what's keeping the lights on. Don't be so afraid, and then trust your people, to give them the room and trust them to get the work done.
So I want to follow up that with one more quick question. People who are sitting on the fence, it's easy to say trust your team. But if you've started a business and your rear end's on the line, or your family's fortune is on the line, are there more pragmatic suggestions, ways to guide leaders into how they can trust their teams? In your own experience, you had reticent leaders or people you've mentored?
Well, I can only cite, when implementing Holacracy, I can only cite my experience on my team. And on my team, I was the internal Holacracy go-to guy. We engaged external Holacracy coaches on a contract, but I was the only one who went to the training from my team, and I asked our director to bring in those external consultants because what I saw from my early training was that if you're going to be recasting the role of manager, there's going to be some issues of self-identity becoming a major issue for these managers that are changing their role. And I didn't have the expertise to coach them through that. So I said, bring in some experts to do that. And so would I be prepared to be ready to coach leaders, and if you're a leader and you want to do this, you have to be, if you're going to invest your authority in the Holacracy Constitution, you have to have a sense of commitment to begin with. Get coaching yourself first.
All right, we need to wrap this up. Hannah raised a terrific question that unfortunately we don't have time to delve into about accountability. We will bring that up in some future webinars. Brian, I really appreciate your generosity in being the first victim in our series of webinars and flowing with all of this. Any parting piece of advice, any joke you want to leave us with, anything to have us remember in a sentence or two?
I love thinking of myself as a key piece of a big experiment.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Again, it's responsive.org. If you haven't signed up, please do so, and you'll get all sorts of information about future workshops, as well as the Responsive Conference, which will be in Las Vegas in the fall. Thanks so much. We'll see you later.